15 years of silence, forged in ice and gold. Can love survive where the past never lets go, and the world demands a betrayal? When the manor walls breathe with cold, only one choice remains: to burn together or fade apart. This story begins now. The silence in the drawing room of Malfoy Manor was not empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the high, enchanted ceilings and settled into the velvet of the armchairs. It was the silence of 15 years distilled into a single, suffocating evening. Outside, the October rain lashed against the diamond-paned windows, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that sounded too much like impatient fingers tapping on a table. Inside, the only light came from the fireplace, where emerald flames licked at the charred logs, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched across the Persian rugs like grasping hands. Hermione stood before the tall, gilded mirror, smoothing the fabric of her dress. It was silk, a deep, midnight blue that shimmered like a bruised sky. She had chosen it because he used to say it made her look dangerous. Now, looking at her reflection, she saw only exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes and the set of her jaw. 15 years. Today marked a decade and a half since they had stood in a small secret ceremony in France, defying the world, defying their blood, defying history itself. They had promised to be enough for each other. She lifted a silver hairbrush, her hand pausing in mid-air. Her fingers were trembling, just slightly. A tremor of nerves that shouldn't belong to the Deputy Minister for Magic, the brightest witch of her age, the woman who had helped bring down a Dark Lord. But here, in the heart of this ancient, whispering house, she wasn't a war heroine. She was just a wife waiting for a husband who had been drifting away from her, inch by agonizing inch, like a continent breaking off into the sea. The heavy oak door creaked open. The air in the room shifted instantly, the temperature dropping a fraction of a degree. Hermione didn't turn around. She watched him enter through the reflection in the mirror. Draco. Time had been kind to his features, refining the sharp angles of his youth into a terrifying aristocratic beauty. At 36, he was a study in monochrome elegance. His platinum hair was cut shorter now, severe and precise, contrasting with the black robes that seemed to swallow the firelight. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Mercury, storm clouds. Once they had burned with a desperate, hungry fire for her. Tonight they were opaque, barred windows. He moved with that fluid, predatory grace that never left him, walking straight to the crystal decanter on the side table. He didn't look at her. "You're ready," he said. His voice was low, a smooth baritone that vibrated in her chest, scratching at old wounds. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, delivered with the sterile politeness of a stranger. "I have been ready for an hour, Draco," Hermione replied, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She turned slowly, the silk of her dress rustling like dry leaves. "Happy anniversary." Draco froze. The crystal stopper in his hand caught the light, fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows that looked out of place in the gloom. He didn't pour the drink. He set the stopper down with a clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Happy anniversary," he echoed. The words felt ash-dry. He finally turned to face her, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. His gaze travelled up the length of her blue dress, lingering on the curve of her waist, the exposed column of her throat. A flash of raw, unadulterated want darkened his eyes, a hunger so intense it made Hermione's breath hitch. He's still there, she thought, a desperate hope flaring in her chest. Under the guilt, under the years, he still wants me. But as quickly as it appeared, the shutter came down. He blinked, and the ice returned. He took a sip of the amber liquid he hadn't poured, realizing his glass was empty, then set it down with a grimace. "You look." He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't betray him. "Appropriate for the occasion." "Appropriate," Hermione repeated. The word tasted bitter. She took a step toward him, crossing the invisible line he had drawn between them. "Is that what we are now? Appropriate?" Draco turned his back to her, leaning heavily against the mantelpiece, staring into the green flames. "Don't start, Hermione. Not tonight." "When, then?" she demanded, her voice rising. "When do we talk about it, Draco? The letters are getting worse. The Prophet is running editorials about the Malfoy stain on the Ministry. And you're disappearing." "I am right here," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "No, you're not. You're a ghost in this house." She reached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. The wool of his robes was cold, damp from the rain outside. He flinched, a microscopic tensing of muscle, as if her touch burned him. Rejection, sharp and familiar, pierced her, but she didn't pull away. She slid her hand up to the nape of his neck, her fingers tangling in the short hairs there. "Draco, look at me." He resisted for a moment, his body rigid, a statue of marble and regret. Then, with a shuddering exhale, he turned his head. They were close now, so close she could smell the scent of him, expensive parchment, rain, and the faint metallic tang of the potions he brewed in the cellar to keep his mind quiet. His face was pale, the dark circles under his eyes vivid against the white skin. He looked shattered. "They will never stop, you know," he whispered, and the vulnerability in his voice tore at her. "The world. They look at you and see the future. They look at me and see the past that refuses to die." "I don't care about them," Hermione said fiercely, her thumb stroking his cheekbone. "I chose you. I choose you every day." "You chose a difficult path," he murmured, his eyes searching hers, looking for the regret he was sure must be there. "You could be minister by now if you hadn't married a Death Eater." "Ex-Death Eater," she corrected, her voice softening. "And I will be minister. With you." Draco let out a harsh, mirthless laugh. He reached up and caught her wrist, his grip tight, almost painful. His fingers were freezing. "With me? Hermione, I am the anchor around your neck. I am the reason half the Wizengamot won't look you in the eye. Do you think I don't see how you have to work twice as hard to clear the mud I drag into your life?" "I don't care," she repeated, but her voice wavered. The doubt, the insidious, quiet doubt that lived in the back of her mind, stirred. Was he right? Was she ruining her life's work for a love that was consuming them both? "You should care," he said, and then he did something that stopped her heart. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. It was an intimacy so sudden, so desperate, it made her knees weak. He closed his eyes, breathing her in as if she were the only oxygen in a drowning world. His other hand came up to wrap around her waist, pulling her flush against him. For a moment, the war, the politics, the 15 years of struggle dissolved. There was only the heat of his body, the frantic beat of his heart against hers, the way his thumb traced the line of her spine through the silk. "You smell like vanilla and old books," he murmured into her hair, his voice breaking. "Gods, Hermione." She melted into him, her hands clutching his lapels. "Draco, please, just let me in. We can fight this. We've always fought." He pulled back just enough to look at her lips. The tension in the room coiled tight, snapping and electric. He was going to kiss her. She knew it. She needed it, needed the bruising, claiming confirmation that she was still his, that they were still us. She tilted her head back, her eyes fluttering shut, waiting. The clock on the mantel chimed the quarter hour. The sound shattered the spell. Draco stiffened. The warmth drained out of him as if a plug had been pulled. He released her waist and stepped back, creating a chasm of 3 feet that felt like 3 miles. His face smoothed over, the mask sliding back into place with terrifying precision. "We will be late for the reservation," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion that had been there seconds ago. He adjusted his cuffs, not looking at her. "And the paparazzi are waiting. We must put on a show." Hermione stood frozen, her skin still tingling from his touch, the phantom sensation of his body haunting her. The rejection was physical, a blow to the stomach. He had pulled her close only to push her away, reminding her that his guilt was stronger than his desire. "Is that all this is to you now?" she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "A show?" Draco walked to the door, his hand hovering over the brass handle. He paused, his back to her. His shoulders were hunched, bearing the weight of an invisible sky. "It's the only way I know how to protect you," he said to the wood of the door. "Let's go, Granger. The world is watching." He opened the door and walked out into the dark, drafty corridor, leaving her alone in the room with the dying fire. Hermione stared at the empty doorway. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces of her composure together. She would go. She would take his arm. She would smile for the cameras and pretend that her heart wasn't slowly breaking inside the chest he had just pushed away. But as she blew out the candles, plunging the room into darkness, a terrifying thought took root in the shadows of her mind. Maybe love wasn't enough. Maybe, after 15 years, the echoes of their past were finally drowning them out. She stepped into the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking like a countdown on the stone floor. She didn't know it yet, but the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break within these walls. The carriage ride to London was a masterclass in atmospheric torture. Draco sat across from Hermione, his profile etched in silver by the passing street lamps of the wizarding districts. He looked like a man carved from ice, his gloved hands resting motionless on his knees. The space between them was barely 2 feet, yet it felt like a canyon filled with jagged glass. Hermione watched the rain streak across the window, the droplets racing each other like the frantic thoughts in her head. Every time the carriage jolted, her knee brushed his. Each contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that he seemed determined to ignore. She wanted to scream, to reach out and shake him until the aristocratic mask shattered, and the man who had breathed her name into her hair 5 minutes ago returned. Instead, she adjusted her silk wrap, her fingers brushing the cool skin of her collarbone. "You're thinking too loudly, Hermione," Draco said suddenly. He didn't turn his head. His voice was a low hum that vibrated against the velvet upholstery. "Perhaps, if you spoke at all, my thoughts wouldn't have to fill the vacuum," she retorted, her voice clipped. "You're receding again, Draco. You're pulling into that fortress you built during the war. I thought we tore those walls down years ago." Draco finally turned his gaze toward her. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide in the dim light of the carriage. "The walls were never torn down, love. They were merely remodeled. I built them to keep the world out, but I forgot that they also keep you trapped inside with a ghost." "I am not trapped," she snapped, leaning forward. The scent of her perfume, sandalwood and rose, filled the small space, a direct challenge to his coldness. "I am here by choice. Stop treating our marriage like a prison sentence you're serving out of some misplaced sense of martyrdom." Draco's jaw tightened. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The tension between them snapped tight, a wire pulled to the breaking point. "Is it martyrdom to want the woman I love to have the life she deserves? Every time you stand on a podium and they whisper Malfoy like it's a curse, a piece of me withers. You think I don't see the way you flinch when the Howlers arrive at breakfast?" "I flinch because of what they say about you, not me," Hermione cried, her hand flying to his chest, bunching the fabric of his black robes. "I don't care about the minister's seat if it means losing the man who stays up with me when the nightmares of the war return. I don't care about their blood purity nonsense." "But they do," Draco whispered, his hand coming up to cover hers. For a second, the warmth returned. He squeezed her fingers, a desperate, crushing pressure. "And as long as they do, I am the rot in your foundation." He pulled his hand away as the carriage slowed to a halt. The sounds of a bustling London street filtered through the enchanted wood, the muffled roar of a crowd, the rhythmic flashes of magical cameras. "Mask on, Minister," Draco murmured, his voice returning to that terrifyingly neutral tone. He stepped out of the carriage first, extending a hand to her. As Hermione took his hand, she felt the coldness of his leather glove. He didn't grip her palm. He offered only a stiff, formal support. She stepped out into a blizzard of white light. The flashbulbs of the Daily Prophet photographers were blinding. A wall of reporters pressed against the velvet ropes outside the Gilded Cauldron, a restaurant that catered to the elite and the infamous. Mrs. "Malfoy, over here!" "Hermione, is it true the Malfoy estate is funding the new Muggleborn integration bill to buy your votes?" "Draco, look this way. Give us a smile for the reformed column." Draco's face was a masterpiece of boredom. He tucked Hermione's arm into his body a rigid shield between her and the baying crowd. He didn't speak, didn't blink at the flashes, didn't acknowledge the insults buried in the questions. He simply marched her forward, his stride long and purposeful. Inside, the restaurant was a sanctuary of candlelight and floating violins. The maitre d' bowed low, too low, with a sycophantic edge that made Hermione's skin crawl, and led them to a secluded table in the back, shielded by a shimmering privacy charm. As soon as the charm settled around them, dulling the noise of the dining room, Draco collapsed into his chair. He didn't look at the menu. He stared at the flickering candle in the center of the table as if it held the secrets to his execution. "That was lovely," Hermione said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she threw her napkin onto the table. I especially enjoyed the part where they called our life's work a bribe. They are vultures, Draco said softly. But vultures only circle where there is a scent of death. Stop it, Hermione hissed, reaching across the table to grab his hand. He tried to pull away, but she gripped him tighter, her nails digging into his skin. Stop talking like we are already buried. We are having dinner. It is our anniversary. Look at me, Draco Lucius Malfoy. Look at me and tell me you're still in there. He looked up. The candlelight reflected in his grey eyes, making them look like molten silver. The silence between them stretched, thick with the weight of everything they weren't saying. The restaurant around them disappeared. The clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation faded into nothingness. There was only the heat of her hand on his and the frantic, unspoken plea in her eyes. I am here, he said, his voice cracking. But I'm tired, Hermione. I'm so tired of fighting a war that ended 18 years ago, but refuses to stop claiming casualties. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. It was the first honest touch of the night. Not for the cameras, not out of habit, but out of a raw, bleeding need. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a lingering, desperate reverence. I remember the way you looked in the library in 6th year, he whispered against her skin. Before everything went to hell, you were surrounded by mountains of parchment. Your hair was a disaster, and you looked so alive. I hated you for it. I hated you because I knew I would never feel that light. And now, 15 years later, I look at you and I see that light dimming because you're trying to carry my shadow. Your shadow doesn't dim me, Draco, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. It defines the edges of my light. I wouldn't know how to be this strong if I hadn't fought for us. She leaned across the table, her face inches from his. The candle flame danced between them, casting flickering shadows across his sharp features. Kiss me, she whispered. Right here. Forget the privacy charm. Forget the ministry. Forget the Malfoys. Just kiss me like you did the night we decided to run away. Draco's eyes searched hers. For a moment, the seesaw tipped toward warmth. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin beneath her ear. His touch was electric, a searing heat that made her breath hitch. He leaned in, his lips a breath away from hers, the tension between them coiling into a physical force. Then he saw something over her shoulder. His hand dropped, his face turned to stone. What is it? Hermione asked, her heart sinking. Lucius's old friends, Draco spat, his voice laced with venom. The not contingent. They're staring, Hermione. They're laughing. They think it's a charming performance, the lioness taming the stray dog. He pulled back, the warmth vanishing as if it had never been there. He picked up his wineglass, his movements sharp and aggressive. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than before. I can't do this here, he said, his voice cold and distant. I can't be your romantic lead while they watch us like a freak show. Then let them watch, Hermione cried, but he was already signaling for the check. The repulsion was instantaneous, a physical ache in her chest. She had reached out, offered him her soul on a silver platter, and he had swatted it away because of a look from a group of aging bigots. The trust she had felt building moments ago shattered into 1,000 jagged doubts. Does he care more about their opinion than my heart? Or is his shame so deep he can't bear to be loved in the light? They left the restaurant in a silence far more terrifying than the one they had arrived in. As they stepped back out into the rain, Draco didn't even offer her his arm. He walked a pace ahead, a solitary figure in the dark, leaving her to navigate the flashes and the screams alone. As the carriage door clicked shut behind them, Hermione felt a coldness settle into her bones that no warming charm could touch. The second part of their night had ended, and the chasm between them had just grown wider. The manor felt different when they returned, not like a home, but like a museum of things that had died a long time ago. The house elves had lit the lamps in the grand hallway, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the dark Malfoy portraits that lined the walls, their painted eyes tracking Hermione with a disdain that 15 years of marriage hadn't softened. Draco stripped off his travelling cloak with a violent efficiency, flinging it onto a mahogany side table. He didn't wait for her. He strode toward the library, his boots echoing like a hollow heartbeat on the marble. "Draco, stop!" Hermione's voice cracked through the silence. She caught up to him at the threshold of the library, her hand catching the heavy sleeve of his robe. "You can't just walk away. You can't leave me standing in the rain while you retreat into your head." He spun around, his face a pale mask of fury and exhaustion. "I didn't leave you in the rain, Hermione. I brought you home. I shielded you from those bastards who think you're a trophy I stole, and from the other bastards who think I'm a leash around your neck. I don't need a shield, Draco. I need a husband." She stepped into his space, her chest heaving, the blue silk of her dress shimmering under the chandelier. "I need the man who looked at me across a table 5 minutes ago and almost kissed me. Where did he go?" Draco's eyes flared, a flash of silver lightning. He grabbed her upper arms, not roughly, but with a desperate, grounding grip. He went where he always goes when the world reminds him that he's a Malfoy. He went into hiding so he wouldn't break you. "You're breaking me right now by pushing me away." He let out a low, guttural sound and backed her into the library, the door swinging shut behind them with a heavy thud. The room smelled of cedar, old parchment, and the lingering scent of the scotch Draco favoured. He pressed her against the door, his body a wall of heat against her cold skin. For a breathless moment, the tension shifted. The anger was still there, but it was being rapidly overtaken by a jagged, sharp-edged desire. His hands moved from her arms to her waist, pulling her flush against him. Hermione gasped, her head falling back against the wood. "You want the truth?" Draco whispered, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. "The truth is that every time I see Not or any of those pure-blood fossils looking at you, I want to gouge their eyes out. Not because they're insulting me, but because they're looking at something they don't deserve to even breathe the same air as. And then I realize, neither do I." "Draco, no." "Yes," he hissed, his mouth moving down the curve of her throat. His touch was frantic now, his fingers trembling as they tangled in her hair, pulling the pins loose until the brown curls tumbled over his hands. "I am the son of a man who would have seen you dead. I carry his name. I live in his house. And every day I wake up next to you, I wonder when the universe is going to realize its mistake and take you back." He kissed the hollow of her throat, a hard, bruising contact that was more of a plea than a caress. Hermione's hands found his hair, her fingers gripping the platinum strands, pulling him closer. This was the seesaw, the violent swing from his cold withdrawal to this desperate, suffocating need. It was a warmth that burned, a trust built on the edge of a blade. "You are not your father," she breathed, her eyes closing as his lips found the sensitive skin beneath her jaw. "And I am not a mistake. I am yours. Why can't you just believe me?" He pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were tortured, searching her face for a lie he clearly hoped to find so he could justify his own self-loathing. "Because I love you more than I hate myself," he whispered. "And that is a very dangerous amount of love, Hermione." He leaned in, his mouth inches from hers. She could feel the ghost of his breath, the heat of his skin. She parted her lips, her heart thundering, waiting for the bridge to be crossed. But then his gaze flickered to the desk behind her. Lying there, stark and white against the dark wood, was a stack of official ministry scrolls. The top one bore the seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It was an inquiry, the latest in a string of routine investigations into the Malfoy assets, a thinly veiled attempt by her political rivals to find a crack in her armor by digging through his past. Draco's grip slackened. The fire in his eyes didn't go out. It turned to ash. "They're still digging," he said, his voice dropping to a flat, dead tone. He released her so suddenly she almost stumbled. "Draco, it's just politics. Robards has to look like he's doing something." "It's not just politics, Hermione. It's your life." He paced away from her, his shadows stretching long and distorted across the bookshelves. "They are using me to destroy you, and you're letting them because you're too stubborn to admit that I'm a liability." "I am not letting them do anything. I am winning." "Are you?" He turned, his face illuminated by a single candle on the desk. "You look like you haven't slept in a month. You spend your nights defending a man who spent his youth trying to kill your friends. Does that feel like winning?" The repulsion hit her then, sharp and cold. Not repulsion for him, but for the situation he was forcing her into. He was taking her strength and twisting it into a weakness. "How dare you?" she said, her voice trembling with a new kind of rage. "How dare you tell me what my sacrifices mean? I fought for you when no one else would. I stayed when everyone told me to run. Do not tell me I'm losing because I chose to love you." "Maybe you should have listened to them," Draco said quietly. The words were a betrayal, a jagged piece of ice thrown into the heart of their 15 years. Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. "Is that what you want? For me to have listened? For me to leave?" Draco stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, becoming a barrier more impenetrable than the manor's wards. He looked at the ministry scrolls, then back at her messy hair, her tear-streaked face, and the blue dress that was supposed to be for a celebration. "I want you to be happy," he said finally, "and I don't think I'm capable of making you happy anymore. I'm just making you tired. You don't get to decide that for me." "I'm making the decision for myself," he countered, his voice hardening into that familiar Malfoy frost. "I'm going to the guest wing, Hermione. I think we both need to remember who we are without each other." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers, a cold, accidental contact that felt like a finality. He didn't look back as he left the library, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him. Hermione stood in the center of the room, surrounded by thousands of books, yet feeling more illiterate than she ever had in her life. She couldn't read him. She couldn't solve this. The warmth of their brief embrace had evaporated, leaving her shivering in the drafty room. She walked to the desk and picked up the ministry scroll. With a cry of frustration, she threw it into the fireplace. She watched the parchment curl and blacken in the green flames, but it didn't make the weight in her chest any lighter. Upstairs, she heard a door click shut. The house was silent again. But this time, the silence didn't feel like a wait. It felt like an ending. She sank into his chair, her head in her hands, the smell of his scotch and parchment mocking her. 15 years. And tonight, for the first time, she wondered if they would make it to 16. The night did not bring sleep. It brought only the cold, sharp clarity of the moon. Hermione lay in their expansive four-poster bed, the silk sheets feeling like ice against her skin. The space beside her was a vast, empty desert. For 15 years, the dip in the mattress, the rhythmic sound of Draco's breathing, and the occasional possessive reach of his arm in his sleep had been her anchor. Now, the silence of the master suite was deafening, amplified by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway that sounded like the steady drip of a leaking wound. She turned onto her side, staring at the silver-threaded hangings of the bed. Her mind was a chaotic library of what-ifs. What if he doesn't come back from the guest wing? What if I've spent 15 years building a home on a foundation of ash? The emotional seesaw had swung so violently into the cold that she felt physically bruised. This was the betrayal she hadn't expected. Not an affair, not a lie, but the betrayal of his withdrawal. He was giving up on their us to save her, and it was the most arrogant, infuriatingly Malfoy thing he had ever done. Unable to bear the stillness, Hermione threw back the covers. She didn't reach for her robe. The chill of the manor felt appropriate. She needed to see him. She needed to bridge the chasm before it became a permanent fixture of their geography. The corridors of Malfoy Manor were treacherous at night. The shadows seemed to move, whispering of old blood and ancient prejudices. As she walked toward the West Wing, she passed the portrait of Lucius. Even in the dim light, his painted eyes seemed to sneer, a silent reminder that the ghost of the father still dictated the movements of the son. She reached the door to the guest suite. No light filtered through the gap at the bottom. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. If he turns me away now, it's over, she thought. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the pale, ethereal glow of the moon. Draco wasn't in bed. He was standing by the window, a silhouette of sharp lines and shadowed grief. He had stripped off his robes and was dressed only in his white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the faded, blurred ink of the dark mark on his left forearm. He was staring at it, his thumb rubbing the scarred skin with a repetitive, obsessive motion. He didn't turn when she entered. "I told myself you wouldn't come," he said, his voice a ghost of a sound. "I told myself you were too smart to chase a sinking ship. You should know by now, Draco, that I never listen to what I'm told," Hermione replied softly. She closed the door behind her, the click echoing in the cavernous room. She walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. As she got closer, she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his entire body was coiled like a spring. He looked fragile, as if a single touch would shatter the porcelain veneer of his composure. "Why are you looking at it?" she asked, gesturing to his arm. "Because it's the only honest thing about me," Draco spat, finally turning to face her. The moonlight caught the moisture in his eyes, making them look like polished silver. "This Mark doesn't care about 15 years of marriage. He doesn't care about my donations to the St. Mungo's or my rehabilitation. It's the truth of what I am. And the truth is, I will always be the boy who let the monsters in. You were a child, Draco, a terrified child with no choice. There is always a choice, Hermione. You chose to fight. Potter chose to die. I chose to survive at any cost." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "And now, the cost is you. I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. You look at me with pity. You're not my wife anymore. You're my keeper." The word pity hit her like a physical blow. "Pity? Is that what you think this is?" She reached out, her hand flying to his chest, feeling the frantic, uneven thud of his heart beneath the thin linen of his shirt. "I don't pity you, Draco. I love you. But right now, I loathe you for being such a coward." He flinched as if she had struck him. "A coward?" "Yes. It is easy to hide in this house and wallow in your guilt. It is hard to stand beside me and face the world. You're choosing the easy way. You're trying to push me away so you don't have to feel the weight of their judgment anymore. You're leaving me to face them alone." The air between them crackled. The tension was no longer just sorrow. It was a living, breathing thing, a cord of electricity connecting their bodies. Draco's hand shot out, catching her jaw, his fingers splaying across her cheek. His touch was a contradiction, rough with desperation, yet trembling with a profound, terrifying tenderness. "I am trying to set you free," he groaned, his eyes searching hers with a pleading intensity. "I don't want to be free. I want to be yours." She surged forward, closing the distance. She didn't kiss him. She pressed her face into the crook of his neck, breathing in the scent of him that she had been craving all night. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him with every ounce of strength she possessed, as if she could fuse them back together by sheer force of will. For a long, agonizing second, Draco remained rigid. He stood like a statue, his breath hitched in his throat. Hermione felt the familiar surge of rejection, the coldness, the repulsion. She began to pull back, her heart breaking, thinking she had lost the gamble. Then, with a sound that was half sob, half growl, Draco's arms snapped around her. He pulled her so tight it hurt, his hands fisting in the silk of her nightdress. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with the force of his release. The wall hadn't just cracked, it had disintegrated. The warmth flooded back into the room, a torrential wave of relief and raw, unfiltered intimacy. "Don't leave me," he whispered into her ear, the words a total surrender. "Please, even if I try to make you, don't go. I'm a mess, Hermione. I'm a goddamn wreck." "I know," she murmured, her own tears finally falling, wetting the collar of his shirt. "I've known for 15 years. I'm not going anywhere." They stood there in the moonlight, two broken pieces fitting together in the dark. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a sanctuary. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumbs wiping the tears from her cheeks with a reverence that made her heart ache. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Their breaths mingled, a shared rhythm in the quiet room. He didn't kiss her lips, not yet, but he kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the tip of her nose. Each touch was a promise, a slow-burn rebuilding of the trust he had spent the evening dismantling. "We have to go back to the ministry tomorrow," she whispered. "The inquiry, the press." "Let them come," Draco said, his voice regaining a hint of its old iron. "Let them dig. They'll only find that I belong to you, and that is a vault they can't break into." He picked her up, her legs instinctively wrapping around his waist, and carried her to the bed. It wasn't about passion. Not yet. It was about presence. He laid her down and climbed in beside her, pulling the heavy velvet quilt over them both. He drew her back against his chest, his marked arm draped protectively over her waist, his hand resting over her heart. For the first time that night, the emotional seesaw settled. The warmth was deep, grounded in the reality of their shared scars. But as Hermione finally felt sleep beginning to claim her, she heard Draco whisper one last thing into the darkness. "But what if they're right, Hermione? What if I'm the one who finally breaks you?" The question hung in the air, a chilling reminder that while the night had been won, the war for their future was far from over. Hermione reached back, lacing her fingers with his, but the seed of doubt had been planted once more. The morning sun did not bring the usual golden warmth to Malfoy Manor. Instead, it filtered through the heavy mist in pale, watery streaks of grey. The transition from the desperate intimacy of the night to the cold reality of the day felt like a plunge into freezing water. Hermione woke to the sensation of Draco's side of the bed being empty. Again. She sat up, the silk sheets sliding down her shoulders, and saw him across the room. He was already dressed in a charcoal grey suit, the tailoring impeccable, his back to her as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. The man who had begged her not to leave him in the moonlight was gone, replaced by the polished, distant aristocrat who knew how to hide behind a facade of silver and silk. "The prophet arrived early," Draco said, his reflection meeting her eyes in the glass. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed the calm. "Rita Skeeter has a new source within the ministry. They're claiming that my family's old connections to the Nordic dark art circles are being used to influence your upcoming vote on the werewolf legislation." Hermione felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and anger. That's preposterous. Those connections were severed decades ago. "Logic doesn't sell newspapers, Hermione. Scandal does." He turned around, his eyes scanning her with a look of profound, aching regret. "The Wizengamot has moved your hearing forward. It's this afternoon." The seesaw tilted. The warmth of the previous night's reconciliation evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. This was the repulsion, not of each other, but of the circumstances that continued to poison their peace. Hermione climbed out of bed, her feet hitting the cold floor, and walked toward him. She wanted to touch him, to ground herself in his presence, but he stepped back, a deliberate movement that felt like a slap. "Don't," he said softly. "If you touch me, I'll lose my nerve. And today, you need me to be the cold, arrogant bastard the world expects. If I look at you with anything but indifference in that courtroom, they'll see it as a weakness they can exploit." "Indifference?" Hermione's voice rose, trembling. "You want us to pretend we're strangers after last night?" "I want you to win," Draco countered, his voice cracking for a split second before he regained control. And you won't win if you're seen defending a husband who looks like he's crumbling. Put on your armor, Hermione. I'll meet you at the Ministry. The atmosphere in the Ministry of Magic was electric, charged with the kind of nervous energy that preceded a public execution. As Hermione walked through the atrium, the golden statues seemed to loom over her, their silent faces judging her every step. Whispers followed her like a trail of smoke. She kept her chin high, her curls tamed into a severe knot, her robes a stark professional black. But inside, her heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. She entered courtroom 10, the same room where Draco had been tried as a teenager. The memories of that day always hovered here. The smell of damp stone, the oppressive weight of the high benches, the cold light of the Lumos charms. Draco was already there. He was seated in the visitors' gallery, separated from her by a low stone wall. He didn't look at her. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his expression one of bored disdain. It was a perfect performance. Too perfect. Hermione felt a pang of doubt. Is he playing a role, or is he finding it too easy to slip back into this version of himself? The chief warlock cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gavel. Hermione Jean Granger Malfoy, you are here to address the concerns regarding the potential conflict of interest involving your spouse's historical and financial ties. The hours that followed were a blur of accusations and defensive maneuvers. Every time a member of the council brought up the Malfoy name, Hermione felt a flinch she had to suppress. She spoke with her usual brilliance, her arguments sharp and logical, but her gaze kept drifting toward Draco. He remained a statue. Even when a particularly vitriolic wizard from the back benches called him the serpent in the minister's garden, Draco didn't blink. He didn't look at Hermione to offer support. He didn't even clench his fists. He was completely, terrifyingly unreachable. The doubt turned into a slow creeping betrayal. Why isn't he looking at me? She wondered. Why am I fighting this alone while he sits there like a ghost? During a brief recess, she cornered him in a side corridor, away from the prying eyes of the press. The air here was thick with the scent of old enchantments and dust. Draco, look at me, she hissed, her hand catching his wrist. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. His eyes were like flat, grey stones. You're doing well, Hermione. Don't lose your focus. I don't care how I'm doing. I feel like I'm drowning out there, and you're just watching from the shore. I am doing exactly what we agreed, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. I am being the invisible man. If I defend you, I confirm their fears of my influence. If I show emotion, I show a crack in your armor. This isn't an agreement, Draco. This is a slow death. She stepped closer, her chest heaving. I see the way you're looking at these people. You're not just being indifferent. You're letting them win. You're letting them make you feel ashamed of us. I am ashamed. He suddenly exploded, his voice muffled by the privacy charm he snapped into existence with a flick of his wand. He grabbed her shoulders, his fingers digging into the fabric of her robes. I am ashamed that you have to stand in that pit and defend my name every single year. I am ashamed that 15 years hasn't been enough to wash the blood off my hands so it doesn't stain your dress. The warmth surged back in an instant, a violent, painful heat. His eyes were no longer stones. They were a storm of guilt and love. He pulled her into the shadows of a stone pillar, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that wasn't romantic. It was a collision. It tasted of salt, desperation, and the bitter copper of a bitten lip. It was the first time they had kissed all day, and it felt like a drowning person catching a breath of air. Hermione clung to him, her hands fisting in his hair, her heart breaking for the man who thought his very existence was a crime against her career. "Don't be ashamed," she sobbed against his lips. "Please, Draco, just be with me." He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The emotional seesaw was at its highest point, the trust and warmth radiating between them in the dark corridor. "I can't be with you out there," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "But I am with you in here, always." He kissed her once more, a lingering, soft touch that promised everything. And then he let her go. He smoothed his suit, wiped a smudge of her lipstick from his thumb, and stepped back into the light. The mask was back. As they walked back into the courtroom, the coldness returned tenfold. The transition was so abrupt it made Hermione dizzy. She took her place at the podium, her body still tingling from his touch, while he returned to his seat in the gallery and looked away, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. The hearing ended with a probationary clearance, a victory that felt like a defeat. They had survived, but the cost was etched in the lines of Draco's face as they left the ministry through separate exits to avoid the cameras. That evening, back at the manor, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of a fight. It was the silence of a siege. Hermione sat in the library, a glass of wine untouched on the table, waiting for him. When he finally entered, he didn't come to her. He went to the window and watched the rain, his silhouette lonely against the glass. "We won," she said, her voice small. "Did we?" he asked, not turning around. "Or did we just buy another year of pretending?" The doubt returned, more poisonous than before. She looked at his back and wondered if the man she had kissed in the shadows of the ministry was the real Draco, or if the cold statue at the hearing was the man he was slowly becoming. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like it would take a sword to cut through it. "I can't keep doing the seesaw, Draco," she whispered to the empty air between them. "One of these days, we're going to get stuck at the bottom." Draco didn't answer. He only watched the rain, his reflection in the glass looking like a man already underwater. The days following the hearing were a blur of polite isolation. In the wizarding world, victory often felt like a slow-acting poison. Hermione was back at her desk at the ministry, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations died when she entered the tea room. The memos on her desk were drier, more formal. She was the minister apparent, yes, but she was also the woman who went home to a manor built on the bones of the old regime. But the real war was being fought within the walls of that very manor. Draco had become a master of non-verbal distance. He was there, at breakfast, reading the paper, at dinner, cutting his steak with surgical precision. But he was unreachable. The seesaw had stalled in a state of chilling equilibrium. There were no outbursts, no desperate kisses in the hallway, only a crushing, polite silence that made Hermione want to scream. One Tuesday evening, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the manor gardens shrouded in a thick, suffocating fog. Hermione found Draco in the conservatory, a glass room filled with rare moonlight-blooming flora. He was leaning over a silver-leafed fern, his wand movements small and intricate as he performed a delicate health check on the plant. The candlelight from the floating orbs above cast a flickering amber glow over his features. He looked peaceful, and for a moment, Hermione felt a surge of pure, unadulterated resentment. How could he be so calm while their world was fraying at the edges? "The Board of Governors at Hogwarts sent a letter today," she said, her voice echoing off the glass walls. Draco didn't look up. "And? I assume they're still debating whether the Malfoy Scholarship Fund is appropriate, given the current climate." "No," Hermione said, stepping closer. The air in the conservatory was humid, smelling of damp earth and crushed petals. "They've accepted the fund, but they've requested that your name be removed from the public announcement. They want to call it the Granger Grant for Magical Excellence." Draco's hand faltered. The tip of his wand sparked, a tiny sizzle of blue light. He straightened slowly, his gaze finally meeting hers. There was no anger in his eyes, only a weary, hollow acceptance that was 1,000 times worse. "That seems sensible," he said quietly. "Sensible?" Hermione's voice cracked. "Draco, it's an insult. It's a complete erasure of who you are and what you've tried to do to make amends." I told them no. I told them if your name isn't on it, the gold stays in Gringotts. "Then you're a fool, Hermione." He set his wand down on a stone potting bench and turned to face her. The tension between them, which had been a low hum for days, suddenly spiked into a roar. "You are sacrificing a bridge for the sake of a name that is already dead. Let them call it whatever they want. Let them have the gold and forget the giver." "I won't let them treat you like a secret shame." She moved into his space, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "I am not ashamed of you. Why are you so determined to make me feel like I should be?" "Because it would be easier," he shouted, the sudden volume of his voice making her flinch. He stepped toward her, his face inches from hers, his grey eyes burning with a sudden violent heat. "It would be so much easier if you just looked at me and saw the monster they see. Then we could stop this dance. You could be the hero the world wants, and I could rot in this house in peace." "I don't want peace without you." The repulsion was gone, replaced by a desperate, jagged warmth. Draco grabbed her waist, his fingers digging into the silk of her blouse, and pulled her against him with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was a collision of two people trying to occupy the same space to keep from falling apart. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. "I can't keep doing this to you," he groaned, his voice muffled by her hair. "I see the way you look at the end of the day. You're fading, Hermione. My shadow is swallowing you whole." "Then let it swallow me," she whispered, her hands finding the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in the hair at his nape. "I'd rather be in the dark with you than in the sun alone." She pulled back just enough to look at him. The moonlight-blooming flowers around them began to open, releasing a heavy, sweet scent that made the air feel thick and intoxicating. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was electric, humming with the unspoken promise of the night. Draco's gaze dropped to her lips. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip, a slow, deliberate movement that made her knees weak. The can't help but think had won over the can't stand it. The internal conflict that had been tearing him apart seemed to pause, held at bay by the sheer physical presence of her. "You're so stubborn," he murmured, his voice softening into a low velvet caress. "You knew that when you married me." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a mere ghost of a touch, a tease that left her aching for more. But just as she reached for him, just as the trust began to solidify into something real, he pulled back. His eyes searched hers, and for a fleeting second she saw it. The doubt, the betrayal of his own mind. He looked at her, then looked at the dark mark hidden beneath his sleeve, and the wall went back up. Not as high as before, but high enough to keep her at a distance. "Go to bed, Hermione," he said, his voice flat once more. "I have more work to do with the plants." "Draco." "Go," he repeated, turning back to the silver-leafed fern. The coldness hit her like a physical blow. The seesaw had swung again, leaving her stranded in the warmth while he retreated into the frost. She stood in the conservatory for a long time, watching his back, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. She realized then that the external plot, the ministry, the press, the society, wasn't the real enemy. The enemy was the war Draco was still fighting inside himself, a war where he saw himself as the villain and her as the victim. And as long as he believed that, no amount of political victory would ever be enough to save them. As she walked back to the main house, the fog seemed to follow her, creeping into the hallways and settling into the corners. She lay in their bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of his footsteps. Hours later, she heard him enter the room. He didn't turn on the light. He undressed in the dark and slid into bed, keeping a careful distance between their bodies. Hermione didn't move. She waited until his breathing became deep and rhythmic, and then she moved across the gap. She rested her head on his shoulder and draped her arm across his chest. In his sleep, Draco didn't pull away. His hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with hers in a grip that was almost painful in its intensity. Approach, repulsion, trust, doubt. They were caught in the cycle, two souls tied together by a love that was as much a burden as it was a blessing. And as the moon set over Malfoy Manor, Hermione knew that the breaking point was coming. Soon, the seesaw would have to stop, and they would either find a way to stand on level ground, or they would both come crashing down. The breaking point arrived not with a roar, but with a piece of parchment. The following morning, the atmosphere in the manor was brittle, like glass cooled too quickly. Hermione sat at the long, polished breakfast table, the silver service gleaming mockingly in the morning light. Draco was absent. His study door had been locked since dawn. When the ministry owl arrived, it didn't bring the usual bureaucratic fluff. It brought a formal notification. The appointment committee had reached a decision. Hermione read the words twice, her vision blurring. They were offering her the minister's seat, effective immediately, but it came with a standard of public conduct rider, a clause buried in legal jargon that essentially required her to distance her public and private assets from any entities or individuals with unresolved dark affiliations. It was a polite way of asking for a divorce, or, at the very least, a legal separation that would see Draco exiled to the continent while she governed. She didn't cry. The anger was too cold for tears. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the stone floor, and walked straight to Draco's study. She didn't knock. She used a high-level unlocking charm that shattered the silence of the hallway like a gunshot. Draco was sitting behind his desk, surrounded by stacks of ancient ledgers. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the executioner to find the right key. "They sent it to you too, didn't they?" Hermione asked, her voice dangerously low. Draco reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a duplicate scroll. He set it on the desk. They were very thorough. They even outlined a generous settlement from the ministry coffers to ensure I live comfortably in France. And Hermione stepped into the room, the air thick with the scent of old ink and stagnant grief. "What did you do, Draco?" "I signed it," he said. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The betrayal was so sharp, so sudden, that Hermione actually gasped, her hand flying to the back of a leather chair to steady herself. You did what?" "I signed the preliminary agreement," Draco repeated, finally looking up. His face was a mask of agonizing composure. "It's over, Hermione. The seesaw has stopped. I'm getting off so you can stay at the top." "How dare you?" she whispered, the words trembling with a rage that felt like fire in her veins. "How dare you decide my life for me? How dare you sell our marriage for a title?" "I'm not selling it. I'm saving you." Draco surged to his feet, slamming his hands onto the desk. The ledgers rattled. "Look at us. Look at what we've become. We spend our nights in silence and our days in courtrooms. You're the brightest witch of our age, and you're wasting your brilliance defending a shadow. If I stay, they will nibble away at your soul until there's nothing left but resentment for me. I won't be the reason you hate your life." "I hate my life because you won't fight for it," she screamed, moving around the desk to face him. The tension that had been building for 15 years snapped. She shoved him, a hard, desperate push against his chest. "You think this is noble. It's cowardice. You're so afraid of being the villain that you're willing to break my heart just to stay a martyr." Draco grabbed her wrists, his grip like iron. "I am a villain. I will always be the boy who made the wrong choice. And you're the girl who fixes things. But you can't fix me, Hermione. You can't reform the Malfoy name until it's clean enough for the ministry." "I don't want to fix you. I just want to love you." She struggled against his grip, her movements frantic, but he didn't let go. He pulled her closer, their faces inches apart, the air between them thick with the heat of their shared agony. The repulsion was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding honesty that stripped them both bare. "You deserve a hero," he hissed, his voice breaking. "I deserve the man I chose," she countered. "I chose you, Draco. In the rain, in the war, in the silence, I chose the boy who cried in the bathroom and the man who brews my tea when I'm tired. If you sign those papers, you're not saving me. You're destroying the only thing that makes all the rest of it worth it." She went limp in his arms, her forehead dropping against his chest. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, aching vulnerability. "If you leave," she whispered into the fabric of his shirt, "there is no Minister Granger. There's just a woman in a big office who gave up her heart for a seat at a table." Draco's grip on her wrists softened. His hands slid up her arms to her shoulders, his fingers trembling. The silence in the study was no longer heavy. It was fragile. A thin thread of hope stretched to the limit. He let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a sob. I thought I was doing the right thing. I've spent every day of the last 15 years waiting for the moment you'd realize I wasn't enough. I wanted to leave before you asked me to. I was never going to ask, she said, looking up at him, her eyes bright with tears. Never. The trust versus doubt seesaw made one final violent swing. Draco looked down at the papers on his desk, the cold, legal end of their life together, and then he looked at the woman in his arms. The intelligent, fierce, beautiful woman who had spent half her life fighting for him. With a growl of pure defiance, Draco reached out, grabbed the parchment, and held it over the candle on his desk. They watched in silence as the edges curled, blackened, and caught fire. The flames reflected in Draco's grey eyes, turning the mercury to molten gold. He dropped the burning remains into the hearth, where they vanished into ash. "They'll come for us now," Draco said, his voice regaining its strength, its aristocratic edge. "They'll make it impossible. They'll pull your funding. They'll smear your name. They'll turn every friend you have against you." "Let them," Hermione said, a small, fierce smile touching her lips. "I've survived a war and a Horcrux hunt. I think I can handle a few ministry bureaucrats." The warmth that flooded back into the room was different this time. It wasn't the fleeting heat of a desperate moment. It was the steady, burning glow of a shared resolve. Draco reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb stroking the curve of her cheek. The non-verbal intimacy that had been their only language for weeks finally translated into something more. He looked at her with a clarity she hadn't seen in years. The mask was gone. The ghost was gone. There was only Draco. "You're a terrifying woman, Hermione Granger Malfoy," he murmured, his voice thick with a new kind of emotion. "And you're a very difficult man, Draco Malfoy." He leaned in, his lips a breath away from hers. The tension coiled, tighter and tighter, until it wasn't about the ministry or the past or the world outside. It was just about the two of them, standing in a room full of shadows, finally choosing the light. "I love you," he whispered, the first time he had said the words out loud in months. "I know," she replied. "Now show me." He didn't need to be told twice. He closed the gap, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was a declaration of war against the world and a peace treaty between their souls. It was slow, deep, and tasted of salt and survival. But the story wasn't over. As they stood there, locked in each other's arms, a loud official pounding echoed from the front doors of the manor. The ministry had come for their answer. Draco pulled back, a smirk, the old, arrogant Malfoy smirk, flickering on his lips. He reached for his wand and straightened his cuffs. "Shall we go tell them to go to hell, Minister?" Hermione took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, the grip unbreakable. "After you, Mr. Malfoy." They walked out of the study together, moving towards the final confrontation, the echoes of their footsteps sounding like a beginning rather than an end. The front hall of Malfoy Manor was a cathedral of cold stone and ancient echoes. But as Draco and Hermione descended the grand staircase, hand in hand, the air felt different. The shadows that had once felt like grasping hands now seemed to retreat before them. The heavy thudding on the oak doors continued, a rhythmic, impatient demand from the world they had decided to defy. "They sound like they're expecting a surrender," Draco remarked, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. He stopped on the final step, turning Hermione toward him. The morning light caught the sharp silver of his signet ring as he adjusted the lapel of her robes. His touch was no longer hesitant or cold. It was the touch of a man who had finally claimed his place. "They're going to be disappointed," Hermione replied. She reached up, smoothing a stray lock of platinum hair from his forehead. Her fingers lingered there, a silent anchor in the storm. "We aren't the same people they broke 15 years ago, Draco. We aren't children playing at roles anymore." Draco leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. In the quiet before the confrontation, the silence was finally peaceful. "I spent so long trying to be invisible so you could shine," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "I forgot that the only reason I'm still standing is because of your light." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers one last time, ensuring the resolve was still there. Seeing the fire in her brown eyes, he nodded. With a sharp flick of his wand, the massive front doors groaned and swung inward. Standing on the threshold was a delegation from the ministry, flanked by 2 auras in crimson robes. At the center stood Tiberius McLaggen, a man whose ambition was as vast as his lack of imagination. Behind them, in the distance, the iron gates of the manor were swarmed by reporters, their quills hovering over rolls of parchment like vultures. "Minister Apparent," McLaggen began, his voice booming with a false, practiced gravity. He didn't look at Draco. "We have not received your signed confirmation. The press is growing restless. We are here to escort you to the ministry for the official announcement of your transition." Hermione didn't move. She didn't step forward into the light of the cameras. She stayed exactly where she was, her fingers tightly interlaced with Draco's. "There will be no transition, Tiberius," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. "And there will be no announcement, unless it is to declare that the ministry is withdrawing its discriminatory riders immediately." McLaggen blinked, his gaze finally flickering to Draco, then back to their joined hands. A sneer curled his lip. "Hermione, don't be a fool. You are throwing away the greatest political career in a century for the sake of a shadow of the past. Think of your legacy." "My legacy is standing right here," Hermione countered, her grip on Draco tightening. "I didn't fight a war to replace one set of prejudices with another. If the price of being minister is the betrayal of my husband, then the price is too high. You can tell the committee that I decline the seat." A collective gasp went up from the reporters at the gate. The quills began to scratch frantically. Draco stepped forward then, moving slightly ahead of her, his presence commanding and sharp. He looked every bit the Malfoy patriarch, but without the malice that had defined his father. "The ministry has exactly 1 hour to retract the standard of public conduct rider," Draco said, his voice cutting through the damp morning air like a blade. "If it is not withdrawn, I will personally fund a legal challenge that will keep the Wizengamot tied in knots for the next decade. And I will do it as a free citizen of this world, standing beside the woman who actually has the courage to lead it." McLaggen paled. He looked at their auras, but they remained still, their eyes fixed on the floor. They had seen the war. They knew that fighting Hermione Granger was a losing battle. "You're choosing him?" McLaggen stammered, pointing a finger at Draco. "After everything?" Always, Hermione said. She turned to Draco, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the delegates, ignoring the world. The seesaw had finally come to rest. The repulsion was a memory. The doubt was ash. There was only the warmth of a love that had been forged in fire and tempered in silence. Draco looked at her, and for the first time in 15 years, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. His face softened with a raw, agonizing love that made the breath catch in her throat. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her curls. "Hermione," he breathed, her name a prayer and a promise. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss for the cameras or a kiss of desperation. It was a slow, deep, and devastatingly honest kiss. It tasted of home, of rain-soaked libraries, of whispered secrets in the dark, and of a future they would build on their own terms. It was the kiss of two people who had survived the world and, more importantly, survived themselves. In that kiss, the 15 years of struggle dissolved. The whispers of the purebloods, the screams of the howlers, the coldness of the manor, it all faded into the background. There was only the pressure of his lips against hers, the heat of his body, and the knowledge that they were finally, truly, on the same side. When they finally broke apart, the world was silent. McLagan and his delegation were retreating, their faces a mask of defeat. The reporters were still watching, but the narrative had changed. It was no longer a story of a fallen hero or a stained legacy. It was a story of a love that was too strong to be broken by politics. Draco didn't look at the gates. He looked at Hermione, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "What now, Minister?" he asked, a genuine, crooked smile lighting up his face. "Now," Hermione said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they turned back into the warmth of the house. "I think we should go have a proper anniversary breakfast. And then we're going to change the world. Together." Draco laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that echoed through the halls of Malfoy Manor, chasing away the last of the ghosts. He swept her up into his arms, ignoring her startled squeal of laughter, and carried her across the threshold. The heavy oak doors swung shut, closing them off from the prying eyes of the world. But this time, it wasn't a prison. It was a sanctuary. Behind the closed doors, in the heart of the ancient house, the candlelight flickered against the portraits of ancestors who would never understand. But it didn't matter. The Malfoys and the Grangers were gone. There was only Draco and Hermione, and for the first time in 15 years, the echoes in the house were not of the past, but of the life they were finally beginning to live. As the rain began to fall again, soft and gentle against the glass of the conservatory, they sat by the fire. The silence between them was no longer a wait. It was a conversation. "I love you, Hermione," Draco whispered, pulling her closer into the curve of his arm. "I love you too, Draco," she replied, closing her eyes and listening to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. The war was over. The peace had begun. And as they drifted into a quiet, contented sleep in each other's arms, the world outside continued to turn, but it could no longer touch them. They had found the only magic that mattered, the magic of being enough. The morning after the defiance at the gates felt like the world had held its breath and then exhaled a gale of poisonous wind. The victory was loud, public, and utterly devastating. By noon, the ministry had not sent a retraction. They had sent a process server. Hermione sat at the mahogany dining table, which now felt too large for just 2 people. Before her lay a copy of the Daily Prophet. The headline was a jagged scar across the page. The Fallen Idol. Granger prefers dark legacy over ministry seat. The photo showed them mid-kiss, but the grain of the magical print made it look desperate, almost scandalous, rather than the act of devotion it truly was. Draco entered the room, his footsteps silent on the rugs. He was dressed in a simple black sweater and trousers, no suit, no tie, no armor. He looked younger, yet somehow more tired. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and the warmth of it was the only thing keeping her from shattering. "They've officially frozen the discretionary funds for your department," Draco said, his voice flat. "And my accounts at Gringotts are under audit. It seems the ministry's definition of a retraction is a slow starvation." Hermione looked up at him, her eyes burning with a mix of defiance and deep, aching sadness. "I knew they would do this, Draco. I didn't think it would happen within hours, but I knew." "Do you regret it?" The question was a whisper, a ghost of his old insecurity returning to haunt the room. Hermione stood up, turning to face him. She took his face in both her hands, her thumbs brushing against his cheekbones. "I regret that we live in a world that asks me to choose, but I will never regret choosing you. Never." She kissed him, a soft, lingering touch that was meant to reassure him, but the tension between them was palpable. It was no longer the tension of "can't stand it," but the tension of "how do we survive this?" The emotional seesaw had shifted from internal conflict to a shared external struggle, but the weight of it was crushing. As the days passed, the isolation intensified. The flu network remained silent. No owls arrived from Harry or Ron, not because they had turned their backs, she knew, but because the ministry was likely intercepting any communication with the Malfoy traitors. The manor, once a prison of gold and guilt, had become a fortress of silence. Draco spent hours in his study, and Hermione spent hers in the library. They were together, yet the atmosphere was thick with the things they weren't saying. They were both waiting for the other to break, to admit that the cost was too high. One evening, the rain returned, a cold, relentless downpour that turned the gardens into a muddy graveyard. Hermione found Draco in the cellar, where he kept his private potion stores. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and belladonna. He was standing over a bubbling cauldron, the green steam casting a sickly hue over his pale features. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. "A solution," Draco said, not looking up. "The ministry isn't just auditing me, Hermione. They've started the process of historical reclamation. They want the manor. They claim the land was seized illegally by the Malfoys in the 14th century. It's a lie, of course, but a legal lie is as good as the truth if you have the power to enforce it." Hermione felt a cold dread settle in her chest. "They can't take your home, Draco. They can take everything if I don't give them something else." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were dark with a dangerous old shadow. "I have contacts, Hermione. People who still owe my father favors. People who live in the cracks of society where the ministry's light doesn't reach." "No," she said, stepping forward. "We are not doing that. We are not becoming the people they say we are." "Then what are we?" Draco shouted. the sudden outburst making the glass vials on the shelves rattle. We are two people sitting in a cold house, waiting for them to take the roof from over our heads. I see you, Hermione. I see you looking at your old ministry badges. I see you reading the legislation you were supposed to pass. You're dying in here. I am living for the first time, she screamed back. Because I don't have to pretend. I don't have to be the perfect Gryffindor princess for a world that only loves me when I'm useful. The repulsion hit them both then, a sudden, sharp disgust at the reality of their situation. They were fighting over the scraps of a life they had both sacrificed. Draco turned back to his cauldron, his shoulders hunched, his hands shaking as he added a powdered root to the brew. "I'm going to fix this," he murmured. "I'm going to make sure you get your seat back. I don't want it if you're the price." "Then don't watch," he spat. "Go to bed, Hermione. Let me be the Malfoy they want me to be." She stood there for a long time, watching the green smoke curl around his head. The warmth they had found at the front doors seemed a lifetime away. Trust was being replaced by a frantic, jagged doubt. Was he going back to the dark arts? Was he willing to stain his soul again, just to buy her a title she had already rejected? She didn't go to bed. She went to the library and began to dig. If Draco was going to fight dirty, she was going to fight with the only weapon she had ever truly trusted, the law. But as she pulled old, dusty scrolls from the shelves, she realized that the law was a labyrinth designed by the winners, and she was currently the biggest loser in Britain. Hours later, the cellar door creaked open. Draco walked out, his face smudged with soot, looking like a man who had just crawled out of a grave. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the front door, grabbed his traveling cloak, and stepped out into the rain. "Draco!" she called out, running into the hallway. "Where are you going?" He paused at the threshold, the wind whipping his cloak around his legs. The moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw. "To see a man about a debt," he said. "Don't do this. Stay with me." "I am doing this for you," he said, and the coldness in his voice was a betrayal more profound than any lie. He vanished into the darkness of the grounds, leaving the door hanging open. The rain splashed onto the marble floor, a rhythmic, mocking sound in the sudden quiet. Hermione stood in the doorway, the cold air biting at her skin. The emotional seesaw had plummeted. She felt a crushing sense of isolation, not from the world, but from the man who was supposed to be her partner. He was retreating into his shadows, and she was left alone in the light of a house that was no longer a home. She walked back into the drawing room and sat in the dark. The silence was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. She realized then that their relationship was at its most dangerous point. They had survived the world's hatred, but she wasn't sure if they could survive Draco's self-sacrifice. As the clock chimed 3 in the morning, a small black owl fluttered through the open window and dropped a heavy, official-looking envelope on her lap. It was addressed to Mrs. Draco Malfoy in a handwriting she didn't recognize, sharp, jagged, and full of malice. With trembling fingers, she tore it open. It was a copy of the Historical Reclamation Order. But at the bottom, there was a handwritten note. "Your husband has made a very interesting offer, Mrs. Malfoy. We look forward to seeing you back in the ministry, alone." The paper fell from her hands. The betrayal was complete. Draco hadn't just gone to fight for her. He had gone to bargain himself away. The tension in her chest snapped, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. She wasn't going to let him be a martyr. If he wanted to be a Malfoy, she was going to show him exactly what a Granger could do. She reached for her wand, her eyes glowing with a fierce, dangerous light. The story wasn't over. It was just getting bloody. The air in the library had grown stagnant, smelling of old parchment and the bitter, metallic scent of Hermione's own mounting fear. She stood by the window, watching the storm claw at the glass, her reflection a pale, ghost-like shimmer against the darkness outside. The note from the ministry sat on the desk behind her. Its jagged handwriting felt like a physical weight in the room. Alone. The word echoed in her mind, rhythmic and mocking. Draco had gone to the ministry, or worse, to the shadowy intermediaries who lived in its pockets, to offer himself as a sacrificial lamb. He was trading his presence in her life for the restoration of her status. It was a move of classic, self-destructive Malfoy arrogance, a noble betrayal that ignored the one thing she actually wanted. Him. The heavy oak doors of the library groaned open. Hermione didn't turn. She knew the cadence of his step, even when it was heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the night walking through hell. Draco stopped in the center of the room. The smell of ozone and wet wool drifted toward her, cutting through the scent of the books. "You're still awake," he said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of its usual melodic silver. "Did you think I would sleep while you were busy bartering our marriage away?" Hermione turned slowly. Draco was a wreck. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His white shirt was translucent from the rain, and his knuckles were bruised, stained with a dark, purplish tint. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were hollow, the grey washed out into a flat, dead slate. "I did what was necessary," he said, stepping toward the fire, his movements jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. "The reclamation order for the manor has been stayed. Your department's funding will be restored by Monday. You'll receive an invitation to address the Wizengamot on your own terms." "At what price, Draco?" she hissed, crossing the room until she was standing directly in his path. The note said, "Alone. What did you promise them?" Draco wouldn't look at her. He reached for a glass of fire whiskey, but his hand shook so violently that the crystal clattered against the decanter. "I agreed to a period of voluntary exile, 5 years in the estate in France. No contact, no public association. After that, once your position is solidified, the association will be viewed as a dead matter." The repulsion was instantaneous, a cold, sickening wave that made Hermione want to strike him. 5 years? You think you can just step out of my life like a piece of unwanted furniture? You think my love has a 5-year expiration date? "It's not about your love," he suddenly roared, spinning to face her, the glass shattering in his grip. Shards of crystal fell to the rug, but he didn't seem to feel the blood beginning to well in his palm. "It's about your life. You were meant for more than this rotting house and my tarnished name. I am giving you back the world, Hermione." "The world is nothing without you," she screamed back, her voice cracking. "Why is that so hard for you to understand? I don't want the ministry. I don't want the seat. I want the man who promised to stay." She reached for his bleeding hand, her fingers trembling as she tried to inspect the wounds, but he wrenched it away. The seesaw swung violently toward repulsion. The warmth they had shared was a distant memory, replaced by a jagged, sharp-edged wall of mutual misunderstanding. "Don't touch me," he whispered, his eyes filling with a sudden, agonizing moisture. "Every time you touch me, I feel how much I'm holding you back. I saw the way you looked at the prophet today. You missed the fight. You missed the purpose. I'm just a weight, Hermione. I'm an anchor, and the tide is coming in." "You are not an anchor. You are my heart." She stepped into his space, refusing to let him retreat. "And if you go to France, if you leave me alone as they want, you aren't saving me. You're killing the part of me that makes me want to fight in the first place." The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the steady drip, drip, drip of blood from Draco's hand onto the Persian rug. The internal conflict that had defined their 15 years reached a fever pitch. He wanted to save her by leaving. She wanted to be saved by his staying. Then the tension shifted. Draco's knees seemed to buckle. He didn't fall, but he sagged against the edge of the desk, his head dropping. The mask of the noble martyr crumbled, revealing the broken, terrified man beneath. "I don't know how to be enough for you," he whispered, a confession so raw it stripped the air from the room. "I've spent 15 years trying to earn a place at your side, and all I've done is bring you down to mine." Hermione's anger evaporated, replaced by a devastating, protective warmth. This was the trust, the deep, ugly, honest trust that lay beneath the layers of their pride. She moved forward, not with a strike, but with a total surrender. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her ear to his chest, listening to the frantic, irregular thud of his heart. "You were enough the moment you walked into that library in 6th year and cried," she murmured. "You were enough when you didn't identify Harry at the manor. You are enough now." She felt him shudder. His arms stayed at his sides for a heartbeat, resisting the pull, and then they snapped around her, clutching her so tightly it was difficult to breathe. He buried his face in her neck, and she felt the hot, damp trail of his tears against her skin. "I can't go," he groaned into her hair. "I can't leave you." "I'm a coward, Hermione. I'm a selfish, arrogant coward, because I want to stay even if it ruins everything." "Then stay," she whispered, her hands stroking the wet fabric of his shirt. "Let it ruin everything. We'll build something new from the ruins. We always do." The non-verbal intimacy of the moment was profound. They stood in the center of the dark library, two people who had just been ready to tear each other apart, now fused together by a shared, desperate need. The warmth was thick, heavy, and smelled of wood smoke and salt. Draco pulled back just enough to look at her. His face was a mess, blood, rain, and tears, but his eyes were clear. The doubt was still there, a flickering shadow, but the resolve was stronger. "They won't stop," he warned. "If I stay, if we refuse the exile, they'll move from reclamation to prosecution. They'll find a reason to put me in a cell." "Let them try," Hermione said, a dangerous Gryffindor spark returning to her eyes. "I'm the best lawyer in Britain, Draco, and I have 15 years of Malfoy's secrets to use if I have to. If they want a war, we'll give them one they'll never forget." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time in days, a small, genuine ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You really are terrifying. You know that?" "I've heard," she replied, her own lips curving. She reached up, her thumb wiping a smudge of blood from his jaw. The tension between them coiled again, but this time it wasn't anger. It was a slow-burn magnetic pull. The "can't help but think" had returned with a vengeance. Draco leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm not going to France," he promised, the words a vow. "I'm staying, even if the house falls down around us." "Good," she whispered. He didn't wait for her to say anything else. He closed the gap, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was a collision of relief and renewed fire. It tasted of copper and fire whiskey, a bruised, desperate contact that claimed her more deeply than any ministry contract ever could. But as they stood there, wrapped in each other, the green flames of the flue in the corner suddenly flared to life. A voice boomed from the hearth, cold and official. "Minister Robards for Hermione Granger Malfoy. Emergency session of the Wizengamot called for 0400 hours. Subject: the immediate arrest of Draco Malfoy for violation of the Secrecy Act." Draco pulled back, his eyes narrowing. The seesaw didn't swing toward coldness this time. It stayed locked in a fierce shared heat. "They're early," he remarked, his hand going to his wand. "They're too late," Hermione countered, grabbing her own wand from the desk. She looked at him, at the man she had almost lost to his own misguided nobility. The conflict was no longer internal. They were a single unit now, a weapon forged over 15 years of struggle. "Are you ready, Mr. Malfoy?" she asked, her voice steady and lethal. Draco straightened his shoulders, the aristocratic mask sliding back into place, but this time he was wearing it for her. "I've been ready for 15 years, Hermione." They stepped toward the green flames together, the shadows of the library lengthening behind them, prepared to face the dawn and the final battle for their lives. The Ministry of Magic, at 4 o'clock in the morning, was a tomb of cold marble and blue light. The air in the atrium didn't circulate. It sat heavy, tasting of ozone and the ancient metallic dust of the Department of Mysteries. As Draco and Hermione stepped from the flue, the green flames died behind them, leaving them in a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. They were not alone. A line of 6 auras stood between them and the golden elevators. Their wands were drawn, held at the ready position, low but lethal. At the center of the line was Kingsley Shacklebolt. He looked older than he had just a year ago, the weight of a fracturing society etched into the deep lines around his mouth. "Hermione," Kingsley said, his voice a deep, mournful rumble that echoed off the high ceiling. "You shouldn't have come. Not with him." "I don't go anywhere without him, Kingsley. You know that better than anyone," Hermione replied. Her voice was steady, a clear, ringing bell in the cavernous space. She didn't let go of Draco's hand. Their fingers were interlaced so tightly their knuckles were white, a singular, defiant knot of flesh and bone. Draco stood beside her, his chin tilted at that sharp Malfoy angle. He looked like the aristocrat he was born to be, but the coldness in his grey eyes was no longer aimed at her. It was aimed at the world that dared to stand in their way. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was a silent roar of non-verbal intimacy, a shield of heat against the Ministry's chill. "The warrant is for his arrest," Kingsley stated, his eyes shifting to Draco. "The violation of the Secrecy Act regarding the Nordic circles. The committee has the evidence." "The evidence is a fabrication by Tiberius McLaggen to force my husband into exile," Hermione countered, stepping forward, pulling Draco with her. The auras shifted, their wands twitching. And I have the counterbrief. I also have a list of 12 members of the Wizengamot who have been accepting contributions from the same circles you're accusing Draco of courting. The tension in the atrium snapped like a violin string. Kingsley's eyes widened, a flicker of disappointment, or perhaps admiration, crossing his face. You would burn the ministry down for him? I would burn the world down for him, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt more dangerous than a scream. Because he is the only thing in it that is honest. Draco's hand tightened on hers. She felt the tremor in his fingers, not of fear, but of a profound, shattering realization. The seesaw of his internal guilt made one final, agonizing turn. He looked at the woman beside her, the deputy minister, the brightest light of their generation, and he finally saw what she had been trying to tell him for 15 years. She didn't want him to be a hero. She wanted him to be hers. "Let us pass, Shacklebolt," Draco said, his voice finally cutting through the gloom. It was low, calm, and carried the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Or arrest us both. But if you take one, you take the other. We are a single entity. Try to separate us, and you'll find out exactly how much magic a Granger-Malfoy union can generate." Kingsley stared at them for a long minute. The silence was agonizing. The emotional seesaw hovered at the highest point of trust versus doubt. If Kingsley moved, they would fight. If he stayed, they would win. Then, slowly, Kingsley signaled his men to lower their wands. "Courtroom 10 is waiting, but be warned, Hermione. McLaggen isn't just looking for an arrest, he's looking for blood." "He's going to find a storm instead," she said. The walk to courtroom 10 felt like a funeral march. The elevators creaked, the grills clattering like teeth. Inside the small space, the intimacy between Draco and Hermione was suffocating. Draco leaned in, his shoulder pressing against hers, his scent of rain and old books filling her senses. "If this goes badly," Draco whispered, his lips grazing her ear, "I want you to leave. I want you to run." "If this goes badly," she whispered back, turning to look him in the eye, "we're going to France. Not as exiles, but as ghosts. They'll never find us." He looked at her, and the doubt finally died. He didn't say he loved her. He didn't have to. The way his gaze lingered on her mouth, the way his thumb traced the pulse point in her wrist, it was a confession more powerful than any words. The elevator doors opened. The courtroom was a sea of purple robes. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and the collective, nervous breath of the Wizengamot. McLaggen sat at the high bench, his face a mask of triumphant malice. "Draco Malfoy," McLaggen's voice boomed. "You are here to answer for—" "He is here to witness your resignation, Tiberius," Hermione interrupted, her voice cutting through his theatrics. She walked to the center of the floor, leaving Draco at the witness stand. The distance between them was only a few yards, but the tension coiling between them was a physical bridge. Every look they exchanged was a silent support, a non-verbal tether. The next hour was a slaughter. Hermione didn't use a wand. She used her mind. She tore through McLaggen's evidence like it was wet parchment. She revealed the bank records, the secret meetings, the hidden agendas. She turned the courtroom into a mirror, forcing every member of the Wizengamot to look at their own reflections. But the real climax wasn't the legal victory. It was the moment Draco stood up. He didn't wait for permission. He walked down from the stand and stood beside Hermione. He looked at the gathered wizards, the people who had spent 15 years trying to make him feel like a monster. "You want to know why I stayed?" Draco asked, his voice echoing in the rafters. "You want to know why I didn't take the easy way out and leave her to your mercy? Because for 15 years this woman has believed I was worth saving, and today I finally decided she was right." He turned to Hermione. In front of the entire Wizengamot, in front of the press, in front of history, he reached out and took her face in his hands. The warmth in the room became unbearable. The seesaw had finally stopped, reaching a perfect grounded balance. The repulsion was gone. The doubt was gone. There was only this: two people who had survived the dark and were finally stepping into the light. "I am yours," he whispered, loud enough for only her to hear. "In every world. In every life." He leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss of absolute, devastating victory. It was the kiss that ended the war of the last 15 years. It tasted of salt, of survival, and of a future that no longer had to be fought for. Her hands went to his hair, pulling him closer, her body moulding against his as the room around them erupted into chaos. Shouts, flashes of light, the roar of the crowd. It all meant nothing. When they finally broke apart, the Wizengamot was in shambles. McLagan was being led away by Kingsley's auras. The standard of public conduct was being torn to shreds by the legal clerks. Draco and Hermione didn't stay for the applause. They didn't stay for the questions. They walked out of the courtroom, their hands still locked together. They walked through the atrium, past the golden statues, and out into the cool pre-dawn air of London. The rain had stopped. The sky was beginning to turn a soft, bruised purple, the first hint of a new day. Draco stopped her on the sidewalk, pulling her into the shadow of a stone pillar. He looked at her, his eyes bright with a light she had never seen before, a light that wasn't silver, but gold. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "It's just beginning," she replied. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. The tension between them was no longer a burden. It was a promise. The slow burn of 15 years had finally ignited into a steady, unquenchable flame. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, lingering touch that promised a lifetime of such moments. "Let's go home, Hermione," he whispered. "To our home," she corrected. They walked into the dawn, two people who had changed the world simply by refusing to let it change them. And as the sun finally rose over the city, the shadows of the past were finally, truly cast behind them.
Hello, thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is very special to me. It is not just about magic of the withering world. It is about two people who are tired. They are tired of the past. They are tired of what people say. We often think that love is easy after a happy ever after. But for Draco and Hermione, love is a choice. They choose each other every single day, even when it's hard, even when they are afraid. I wanted to show that silence can be heavy, but a single simple touch or look can break that silence. In the end, they didn't need the world to like them. They only needed to trust each other. I hope this story reminded you of one thing. Real law is not perfect. Real law is staying when the world tells you to leave. Thank you for listening. Which part was your favorite? Please tell me in the comments. See you in the next story.